Welcome to this new great talk with our Honorary President at Large, Dr. Rubens Ricupero, who is in Brazil. The title of today's great talk is From Trump to Bolsonaro, Are Far-Right Movements Becoming a Systemic Threat to Democracies? Views from Brazil. Well, in the era of instant and overwhelming information, where important things happen but are often overshadowed by new developments and crises on the other side of the world, it is difficult to grasp all the facts and insights of each event. Dr. Ricupero will help us understand better the developments in Washington and Brasilia that could be, or not, the sign of a trend affecting democracies worldwide. Dr. Ricupero, you are most welcome. We are delighted to have you with us today. And before giving the floor to Manuela to remind us the modus operandi, the Great Talk, and to you for the Great Talk itself, please allow me for the record to recall a few elements of your very extensive bio. Dr. Rubens Ricupero was UNCTAD's 5th Secretary General. Previously, during a long career with the Brazilian government, he was Minister of the Environment and Amazonian Affairs before becoming Minister of Finance, where he supervised the launching of the Brazilian Economic Stabilization Program. His diplomatic posts have included Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations in Geneva, Ambassador to the United States of America, and Ambassador to Italy. At GATT, he served as Chairman of the GATT Council of Representatives, Chairman of the GATT Contracting Parties, Chairman of the GATT Committee on Trade and Development, and Chairman and Spokesman of the GATT Informal Group on Developing Countries. Dr. Ricupero also headed the Brazilian delegations to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and the Conference on Disarmament, and served as Chairman of the Finance Committee at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro. He was a professor of theory of international relations and professor of history of Brazilian diplomatic relations. He's the author of numerous books and essays on international relations, economic development problems, and international trade and diplomatic history. Last but not least, we are so proud that in 2022, Professor Ricupero became Greycells Honorary President at Large. With this, I give you the floor, Manuela, to walk us on the modus operandi of the Great Talk. You're very welcome, Dr. Ricupero.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Very quickly, for those that are not used to the Great Talks, the procedure is always the same. We give the floor to Dr. Ricupero for his own presentation, main ideas, main messages that he would like to flag, to set the scene of the topic that we have today. And then, of course, we open the floor to questions and comments. I would like to share with you an idea that I mean, it's troubling me even in my nights, sort of nightmare that we are seeing not only from extreme right, but also from extreme left. But in this case, let's talk about the extreme right movements that are a sort of virus, a sort of pandemic that seems to be spreading all over the world, in some cases more than others. And we do not have a vaccine, apparently, as we have a vaccine for COVID. So we found a vaccine for COVID, but what is the vaccine for this kind of extremism that is very dangerous for democracy? Over to you, Mr. Ricupero.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manuela. Greetings to everybody. I see from here some friendly faces. Oni is there. It's a long time since we last met, Bijan and others. So it's indeed a pleasure for me to be back to the Greycells talk. And I intend to make a short presentation, basically focus on the similarities between what took place in Brazil and in the US. And then I will stop and we will try to deal with the more general issues, the subjects, for instance, to what extent what happened or still happens in the US or Brazil has something in common with the political situation in Western Europe and in other places. Anyway, I would like to start by just reminding everybody that we all saw, even I imagine abroad, what took place in Brazil. TV covered the events in Brazil on real time, and we saw that what we had in Brasilia on January the 8th was a sort of a grotesque and a totally avoidable replay, a repetition of the invasion of the US Congress 2 years earlier. Of course, even in a larger dimension, because in Brazil, the mob was also able to invade not only the Congress, but the Supreme Court building and the presidential palace. This, by the way, is one of the advantages of having a modern, artificially built capital. As you know, when the capital was built back in the early 1960s, the idea was to concentrate all the buildings where power is embodied in the same place. In Brasilia, they always stand in the same square, the square of the three powers. So it makes it much easier for an attacking mob to invade all the buildings, because they are practically side by side. Well, so striking were the similarities with what had taken place in the US that some understand that there ought to be a sort of a pattern in the repetition. Conspiracy theories helping, it might be feared that an internationally linked far-right movement was behind a concerted attempt to undermine democratic governments around the world. But were those riots, in fact, a harbinger of things to come? If we look closely, the answer has to be no. The two political processes in the United States and Brazil have many points in common. At the same time, they differ in fundamental aspects from what is happening elsewhere. In their chronology, for instance, the political evolution in Brazil coincided with its forerunner in the USA, with a delay of exactly 2 years in almost all details, with great precision, the victories of Trump in 2016 and his political clone, Bolsonaro, in 2018, the government style of a permanent mobilization and electoral campaign, the early ominous attacks on the electoral system, and the suggestions that neither president would accept an eventual defeat at the polls, tight and contested defeats in the presidential elections of 2020 in the US and 2022, respectively, in Brazil, an attitude of denying and refusal in both cases, the spread of versions that the polls had been faked, followed by the violent assault by the mob on the symbolic seats of power. Of course, these similitudes were not mere coincidence. They stemmed from a deliberate imitation. There was an imitation on the part of Bolsonaro, his sons, and the supporters of the successful examples pioneered by Trump, starting from the skillful manipulation of social media in large scale. It's not only the personal links between the Brazilian copy and his model. There are many other connections as well, not always public, between the Bolsonaro entourage and the Trump's advisors, like Steve Bannon and others, a constant interchange of views, attempts to create an international league of like-minded far-right movements in Latin America and Europe, and to some minor extent, they succeeded in establishing this network, at least among a few countries in Latin America and basically Florida. You know, Florida, Miami, Orlando are the basis for the exiled Latin American politicians, including Bolsonaro himself. He's there right now. But the reason why this political copy, this political plagiarism worked so well in Brazil was the presence of social conditions that mirror to some extent those in the United States, particularly in terms of the political process. I refer in particular to the existence in both countries of a very powerful rural sector of agribusiness in rural areas, disaffected from their big metropolis fellow citizens. Secondly, an influential and socially conservative evangelical Pentecostal movement within a political culture where religion and politics freely mix in a way that would be inconceivable in lay countries like France, for instance. A strong political and behavioral contrast among regions of a continental nation, a constituency that favors free access to firearms as a personal defense against perceived rampant crime, a frontier kind mentality. This is very much a particular trait of Brazil and the US, a frontier kind of mentality as regards the environment, Amerindian problems, Indian lands, and many others, despite the many differences in development levels and the historical cultural backgrounds. These characteristics are enough to show that probably no other odd couples of countries in the rest of the world so eerily resemble each other as the United States and Brazil, at least in many aspects of their political process. And this in turn renders highly unlikely that this Washington Brazilian recent experience could be replicated elsewhere. The specific kind of threats embodied in the violent assaults against the capital and the three powers in Brazil were indeed counterproductive, and they finally triggered a backlash in support of democratic institutions. But does that mean that the risk posed by the far right to democracy is finally waning in the USA, in Brazil, or in other nations, and could be dismissed? This is unfortunately not the case, as can be seen not only from the possibility of a Trump comeback next year, but from many other aspects, in facts, including the electoral successes of the far right in Sweden and Italy, just a little before the Brazilian elections. There is undoubtedly a serious crisis of a representative democracy around us, and not only in the US and Brazil. An indication of this perception has been the proliferation of books with titles such as, I quote, How Democracies Die, How Civil Wars Start, The Twilight of Democracy, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, Fascism, A Warning, How Democracy Ends, Why We Were Polarized. These books were all written and published in recent years, showing that we are not living in normal times. Far in the past are the days when the Cold War was ending and Francis Fukuyama could predict that the almost universal acceptation of a liberal democracy and the free market capitalism represented the final form of a political and economic organization of human societies. After more than 30 years of constant disappointments, no one would repeat that naive prediction, not even Fukuyama, whose last book is called Liberalism and Its Discontents. So far-right movements are not so much a cause, but a symptom, a consequence, among several others, of the complex situation at the origin of the current crisis in representative democracy. In my view, the causes of this current crisis are much deeper than the temporary emergence of far-right movements. I believe that we are really facing, in many different countries, particularly in countries of a Western political and cultural tradition, a very serious challenge that could perhaps be summed up in three major problems that have been defying governments over decades now, and for which no system, no political, no economic system was able so far to offer an effective solution. I would say that those are three central challenges of a human society right now are, first of all, global warming. Secondly, the sense of a growing inequality, and not only inequality of an economic nature, of a distribution of income and wealth, but racial, gender, and other kinds of inequality. And finally, this persistent challenge of structural unemployment. I believe that we could, of course, identify other challenges as well. Right now, we are facing, for instance, the return of a traditional war of aggression against Ukraine, with the frustration of people who thought that Europe was finally free from that scourge of war. So there are many other challenges as well. But I would concentrate on those three challenges. And my impression is that as long as human society fails in dealing in an effective way with those three challenges, we are going to face a situation of only constant crisis. My impression is that far-right movements were only very opportunistic in taking advantage of this advantageous occasion, and as they were not tainted by government, they were not in government, so they were preserved, like in the case of Italy. In Italy, practically all major parties have been demoralized once in government. They came to power and they failed. The last one was the movement of 5 stars, but there were others as well. So finally, the far right won the elections because it was the only political movement that had refrained from participating in the last cabinet government. But how long will it take in Italy for this government to fail as well in dealing with the challenges? So this is my a little bit depressing conclusion, and I will stop here, giving you the opportunity to ask questions or to comment on what decided to focus more on the similarities of the situation between Brazil and the US, because it is a particular case. But now we could address other cases as well. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ricupero. That frames very well the topic. As you said, yes, the focus on purpose was on the US-Brazil similarities or differences. But of course, we can now extrapolate depending on the interest of our participants. And so I'm happy to receive questions. You can either write on the chat column or just take the floor. And we have already a question or a comment from David Dror. Could the distinguished speaker please elaborate the link between climate change and the shift rightward and reduction of democracy? Quite a big topic.
Well, if I could start by addressing this topic, I believe the link derives from the feeling of a frustration that governments have been dealing with the global warming problem now for almost 3 decades, and they haven't been able to come up with the political will to do whatever is necessary. Perhaps in the past, in the recent past, we could have said that there was a great deal of uncertainty. This is no longer the case in terms of scientific evidence. And even in terms of a solution, right now, we do have perhaps not all the solutions, but we have some very effective solutions. I will give you just an example, and I will mention the experience of Brazil. This is the case of green sources of renewable energy. You will be maybe surprised to learn that last year in 2022, of the total energy consumed in Brazil, 92% came from new and renewable sources, mostly from hydroelectric power, because we had a couple of very rainy years and the reservoirs were full to the brim. But besides hydroelectric power, we had a lot of energy from wind, from solar energy, and from biomass, from sugarcane biomass. So in the case of Brazil, Brazil is practically reaching a goal that most countries are striving to reach in 2 or 3 decades from now. But this is a glaring exception. It is because of the mix of the energy matrix in Brazil that has always been very largely dependent on hydroelectric power. This is not the case elsewhere. But my point is, when people feel that we are going nowhere, that we are now going to have the 28th meeting of the contracting parties of the Convention on Global Warming, and we are still increasing, not decreasing, the amount of gases in the atmosphere. So there is a feeling that there is an overall failure. And it's not only, I would say, democratic governments, because that applies as well to China, to Russia, to the Indian government that has a different regime. And I think that the result of this feeling of frustration is twofold. On the one hand, many people become passive. They no longer participate in the political life because they feel that they make no difference, and the cause that is dear to them, like global warming, is not going to receive any new attention. And secondly, for the people who are younger, for instance, the Greta Thunberg's generation, people who are on their teens, there is a feeling of a desperation. It's interesting to read, for instance, the different interviews by Greta Thunberg over the years. The other day I was reading at the New York Times an article of someone who talked to her, and he makes this point. She's 20 years old now. She started when she was only 14, 15 years old. And she grew up much more radical than she was some years ago, because she is now completely disappointed, and she no longer believes that governments will be able to do whatever is needed to deal with global warming. So I believe that this feeling of frustration, and even in some cases of a sort of a quiet desperation, you know, the expression must sound a little bit strong. It was used by the American philosopher in the 19th century, Thoreau. Thoreau used to say that most people lead a life of a quiet desperation. That is, they have no hope in their lives. They struggle to make ends meet, but they go ahead as far as they have a life in themselves, but with no hope left. And I think this is a big problem nowadays, there is no hope, because what is hope? If you allow me to try to define hope, hope not in religious meaning, the hope of a better life after we die, but hope in lay terms. Hope is the trust, the confidence, the expectation that the future will be better than the present and much better than the past was. Once people began to realize that the future will not be better than the present, and maybe it will not be better than the past, then of course hope disappears. And to be frank, it's not very easy to see around us when you look around. In what country you could identify a government or a movement that is showing its ability to give hope back to citizens? It's very difficult. Perhaps the only exception I can see, and it will perhaps surprise some of you, is Biden in the US. Even if it could be challenging, to some extent, he was able to approve many projects of law that will deal with the green economy. He's doing something to try to address social problems that have been accumulating for decades. For instance, the fact that real wages are stagnant for 2 decades or more. He's trying to deal with that. He's trying to reinforce the trade unions again. If you look at Europe, where can you find a similar example? What you find in the European Union is a technocratic kind of administration that follows obediently the new liberal recipe. For them, the only solution to every human problem is more austerity. So there is no solution for the Greeks or for the Italians or for the Spaniards or for the Portuguese. I don't see a future in this kind of political program. Even Macron has been a great deception. For me, Macron is a sort of a French Tony Blair, someone who came with fresh ideas. It looked as he would renew things, and now we are seeing that he really has nothing new to propose. When you propose, you suggest to people that they should retire earlier and they should work much longer. It would be okay if work would give satisfaction, would give you some kind of good remuneration. But if you are condemned to repetitive kind of work, and if you don't have an alternative, of course, you will much prefer to retire early than later. So I don't see the possibility of creating hope with this kind of approach. You see, this is why I think the crisis in the democratic process will continue, because you see in France, people who are fighting Macron, they are perhaps they are populists. I'm not denying that, but they are offering something. So my impression is that the frustration comes from the failure. I don't see any government in the world, with the possible exception of some aspects of the US administration, which is proposing new ideas.
Thank you. We have on a totally different topic a question from Rolf Traeger, another UNCTAD friend, who says, although Lula won the presidency, Congress in Brazil is mostly right-wing. How much do you think that this will prevent the presidency of Lula from pursuing its own goals?
Well, you know, in Brazil, parties in Congress are very flexible. They don't follow very rigid ideologies or party programs. And there has been a tradition in Brazil in the last 30 years or so that no government comes to power with a parliamentary majority, because, you know, Brazil, in the same way as Italy, is a country where there is an enormous proliferation of political parties. Theoretically, we have more than 30. In reality, in Congress, with representatives in Congress, we only have 14 or 13. But anyway, this is enough to spread in a broad way the representation, and no government has a majority of its own. So it has to negotiate and to give ministries and administration posts money for public projects, pork barrel politics, like in the US. So I don't think that will be a particular challenge for him. The problem for him lies elsewhere, you know. He is coming to power at a moment when the Brazilian economy would need some reactivation. In Brazil, the central bank is autonomous by law, and the chairman, the governor of the central bank, has a mandate that does not coincide with the president's mandate. And he is enforcing a very tough interest rate policy. Right now, Brazil has an interest rate of 13.75%. If you discount inflation, it is in real terms about 8%, which is the double of Mexico and Chile, which are second and third in terms of a real interest rate. So if you have, like in Brazil, a high interest rate, and you have a public debt that is totally owned by Brazilians. You know, Brazil has no debt in foreign currency denomination. Brazil has a debt that is totally in its currency and in the hands of Brazilians. But Brazilians love to lend to the government because they will get a return of inflation plus 6% in real terms, which, as you know, anywhere in the world would be a dream. Where you who live in Switzerland, how could you have an investment in Switzerland that would ensure you to have inflation plus 6% in real terms? So there will be no productive investment capable of competing with the interest rates of the central bank. So now there is a war in Brazil between the central bank and the presidents of the country, and we don't know how it will end, because the financial markets, of course, they totally support the central bank. They want more blood, more austerity, more interest rates. And Lula doesn't have the means. He doesn't have the political power to overturn the central bank. So this is the big question mark in Brazil, because, you know, in many other aspects, Brazil is doing fine. If you look, for instance, at Indian problems, Brazil now, for the first time in history, has a ministry of the originary people and peoples, and all the important jobs are held by Indians themselves, people who have gone to university and who are Amerindians. There are no white men in this ministry. Brazil has a wonderful minister for the environment, Marina Silva, who is waging a very courageous war against gold miners and protecting Yanomami Indians in the Amazon. So in this field of human rights, social issues, prospects are very bright. The problem is the economy. The economy last year had a reasonable growth rate of about 3%, but this year we do not expect more than 1%. And you know, Brazil is a country where there are still many poor people. So it is the problem of austerity all over again. I don't think the Brazilian cases will interest you very much, but anyway, it is a particular case. But that was the question. I saw Hamdani there. Hello. It's a long time, Khalid Hamdani.
Khalil, you have your mic closed. So in the meanwhile, we have two questions related to other countries. And again, the comparison with Brazil, to what extent we can compare. Francesca is asking, what about India and its turn to the far right? What similarities can you draw with the underlying causes of the emergence of the far right in the US and Brazil? Or is that determined by India's own specificities?
Well, you say, I don't dare to make many comments on the Indian situation, because I know that India is a universe in itself. I've been several times to India, and I have always been humbled by the experience. It is really complexity at the highest degree, in every sense of the word, in cultural terms, linguistic terms, traditional history, religion, etc. So I fear that the political situation in India should not be easily compared to countries of a different background. In the case of Brazil and the US, you can make some valid comparisons, because although Brazil is a very mixed up society, its political culture is Western. That is, we follow all the traditions in the Western world. Of course, we follow them in a poor way, but This is our model. I'm not so sure regarding India that this would apply. Even the party system in India is different. To be frank, I've been trying to read a great deal about the current government in India, and it is amazing the high degree of support it enjoys from the population. So this, in my opinion, should be taken into account. To be frank, I feel at a loss trying to comment on the current situation in India. I see that there is also a question about Argentina.
Yes, correct. David Dror is thinking about Argentina. He says that Argentina seems to have failed under right-wing and left-wing politics. Corruption and endemic mismanagement of the national economy are the rule rather than the exception. Is Brazil going down that way as well?
Well, starting by the end, there are many people in Brazil who fear that the Argentinian fate is our future. It's true that there are many similarities. In the case of Argentina, I would say they are much further in that situation, because the Argentinian crisis has a different characteristic from Brazil. You know, the Argentinians have the feeling that the past for them was better than the present. What I said when I was talking about hope. You know that most Latin American countries, practically all Latin American countries, had their bicentennial anniversary around now, you know, because every independence in Latin America took place in a short span of time of 20 years, between 1804, which was Haiti, and 1824, that was Peru. In 20 years, all countries in Latin America became independent from Spain, from Portugal. So they were commemorating their bicentennial all around this date. Brazil last year. The Argentinians, you know, Argentina is always a very original country. There was a famous American economist that said that there were three categories of countries: the advanced economies, the underdeveloped countries, and Argentina. Argentina would stand alone as a sort of a category in itself. The Argentinians have two independent dates, in 1810 and 1816. So their bicentennial was commemorated a little earlier. And what struck me reading what was published in Argentina at the time was the feeling of a nostalgia, the idea that the first centennial was much better than the second. There was even a famous analyst in Argentina that said, we Argentinians spent 100 years destroying everything that we had built over the first 100 years. That is a little bit a caricature, no? Because I think things are much more complex than this superficial description. But I would say that the Argentinians are the victims of a trap, an economic and a political trap. Economic, they have been one of the first countries of intermediate level of income that struck this kind of a curse, the curse of the intermediate income rate of development, because they developed very fast through the agribusiness sector, and then they got stuck. They weren't able to complete their industrialization, although they were the first industrial and urban society in Latin America. You know, the first metro line in Buenos Aires was inaugurated before the First World War. So they were quite prosperous at the time. But then they became stuck, and they weren't able just till now to find a different economic form to get ahead. And they are also victims of a political trap, because, you know, Argentina, despite this talk about the right wing and the left wing, in reality, in Argentina, you have the hegemony of the Peronists. The legacy of Perón is such that everybody must be a Peronist, of right or left. You know that when Perón came back to Argentina from his exile in Buenos Aires, there was a massacre at his arrival at the airport, because there was a battle between the Peronists in the far left and the Peronists in the far right. But they were all claiming allegiance to Perón. So you have a situation where elections, when the Peronists unite, they will certainly win the elections. But they haven't been able to reform institutions. And this, by the way, helps me to make another comment that I think would be valid for countries in general, not only for Latin American countries, but it applies to the US and to European countries as well. I'm convinced that in the Western world, the forms that we have of a representative democracy are more or less exhausted. There is a frustration with what people call the deficit of representation. You can see that even in Switzerland. I know that most of you live in Switzerland. I have a granddaughter who is Swiss. I know that even in Switzerland now, people are refraining from voting in the too frequent popular consultations. And there is an enormous drop in popular participation. And this in a country where at least you have partially some institutions of a direct democracy. Because in other democracies, what you have is representative democracy in its pure form. That is, you elect your representative and point. This is the man or the woman who will represent you. And the people no longer feel represented by those elected representatives. One of the consequences is the enormous emergence of NGOs. I believe that to a large extent, this enormous vitality of a civil society, which is taking place everywhere, environmental, human rights, NGOs of all kinds and shapes, they reflect the fact that people don't feel represented by the deputies, the senators, the governors, the people in the executive branch. So they want to take things in their hands. They want to go directly to address problems. So I think this is affecting democracy in general. If you look at the US, for instance, I'm following the debate in the US. Everybody agrees that the US institutions are no longer functional. You see what happens with this paralysis in Congress, with this possibility of stopping a project of law, even when there is a tiny majority, because the minority can block the discussion and the vote indefinitely. And nobody can do anything about that. The lack of representativeness in the US Senate, because states like Idaho or Montana, which have a small population, they have the same number of senators as states like the New York or Florida or others. And there is no way even that the Democrats can convert the District of Columbia into having seats in the Senate or giving seats in the Senate to Puerto Rico, because they are stuck. They can't amend the Constitution. The Constitution is too rigid to amend. So I think when you got to this point, and that you could apply practically to every country in the world, when you got to that point, you have a very dire alternative. Either you find a way of self-reform, or you are going to have a very destructive crisis. You know, the reason why the Americans had the Civil War in the 19th century was, as you know, because they were not able to find a consensual ground on how to deal with the issue of introduction of slavery in the new states, in the territories. You know, that was the reason of the Civil War. So they killed each other in thousands and thousands until that one of the sides finally prevailed. So I think that institutions have to show the capacity to self-reform. But you have a rare instance of that happening. The last time I remember a successful example of a reform in institution was in 1958, when de Gaulle came back to power. He completely reshuffled, overhauled French institutions, and it gave France some decades of functional system. Now I think they are all again hitting a wall. But you see, the case of Italy is a case in point. I follow, you know Italy very well. I also have a family in Italy. Italy has been unable to reform its institutions for decades now. No? They have approved, I don't know how many electoral laws. And once again, they are back to the same point. They don't have working majorities. And in Argentina, you have the same. And I think in Brazil, we are running into the same problem. We have a Congress which embodied many vested interests, and those people don't want to change the electoral laws, the electoral system. You know, in Brazil, there are some absurdities in the electoral law that explain the fact that we have a low level of representativeness. But in other countries, there are also similar problems. And what strikes me more is that in the USA, despite that was why I said that Biden, in my opinion, in a relatively minor way, was showing some success in dealing with some problems, but he has not been able to deal with the deep political problems of the US. You remember when he was elected, he said that his aspiration was to unify the US again. And in reality, the country is as polarized as ever, perhaps even more than it was before. So I think we are finally coming to a close of our debate, and we are not closer to the truth.
Indeed, Dr. Ricupero, we are not close to optimism either, rather the opposite. We are as depressed as we were 1 hour ago, at least in my case, but certainly we have a clearer picture of, we have tools of analysis that you kindly share with us, and I think they're very useful. So over to you, Alejandro. Thank you again, Dr. Ricupero. Alejandro, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just to finish, I would like to apologize to everybody because I'm quite conscious that I was not up to the task. I would like very much to offer some very bright ideas and solutions, but unfortunately, this is the way I see the situation. But this is perhaps it should be a consolation to all of us what Chesterton used to say. Yes, we are all in the same boat and we are all seasick. We are all in the same boat and we are all feeling seasick. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ricupero. You don't really have to apologize. This was really a fascinating session. Thank you really very much indeed. It was not, you're right that it was not really very optimistic, but you really walked us through the similarities from the Washington episode and the Brasilia episode. You went into the deep causes of the challenges that we're facing, the old and new challenges. And you talk even about quiet desperation that we all face and hope. I was very close to you when you mentioned your grandchildren in Geneva, because I have that kind of desperation and I have that problem with hope, not for me, but for my children or my great children. I really think that we all share that kind of desperation. And of course, having at least a clear picture of what's going on and what could happen, I think it's a good start to start thinking about the solutions. You didn't give us many solutions because you acknowledge that nobody seems to have them. But if people like you, UNCTAD and United Nations are working, and if we hope that the SDGs or other objectives will work and there are people working on that, I think that that could give us and future generations a new hope. So thank you very much indeed, Dr. Ricupero. It was a pleasure having you here. Of course, as always, the session has been recorded. We have a good audience this time, and we usually have much more hits when we put this in our website and in YouTube. So thank you very much, and hoping to see you all in our next great talks. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone.